I've always been the kind of person who thrives on routine. Back in 2018, my life was simple: work, home, repeat. I was a graphic designer for a small marketing agency in a quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knows each other. My evenings were usually spent relaxing with a beer on my porch, scrolling through my phone, or occasionally chatting with my neighbor, Mrs. Harvey, a sweet but nosy older woman who loved gossiping about anything unusual in our little community. My house was modest but cozy, with a decent-sized backyard bordered by an old wooden fence. It was a space that rarely saw any activity beyond the occasional squirrel or stray cat. That's why, the evening I came home and found that bike, I felt like the air had shifted somehow, like my safe, predictable world had taken a sharp left turn into something off. The bike was small, clearly meant for a child, but it looked like it had been left out in the elements for years. The paint was faded to a dull blue, with patches of rust spreading like disease across the frame. The tires were flat, and the training wheels were bent at awkward angles, almost like someone had stomped on them in anger. It was leaning against the side of my house, near the back gate, as if someone had just dropped it there and walked off. My first thought was that one of the neighborhood kids had tossed it over the fence, but that didn't make sense. There were no kids in the houses nearby, and even if there were, why would they abandon it in my yard? I glanced around, but the street was quiet, and the shadows were already creeping in with the setting sun. With a shrug, I moved the bike to the corner of my yard, thinking I'd deal with it later. Little did I know, it wasn't going to be that simple. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the bike. I'd placed it near the edge of the yard, behind some overgrown bushes, but it felt like it was still there, waiting for me. I'm not a superstitious person, but something about it unsettled me. It wasn't just the state of the bike. It was the way it seemed so out of place, like it didn't belong to this time or this town. I tried to convince myself it was just some junk someone had dumped, but the thought kept creeping back as I brushed my teeth, turned out the lights, and lay in bed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound, like something metallic scraping faintly against the ground. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, straining to hear. The noise didn't repeat. I told myself it was probably just a raccoon knocking something over, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went outside to check on the bike, half expecting it to be gone. But there it was, exactly where I'd left it. Except, something was different. The handlebars were turned slightly, pointing toward the house, and the front wheel had a streak of fresh dirt, like it had been moved. My stomach churned as I looked around the yard. The gate was still latched from the inside, and the bushes around the fence were undisturbed. It didn't make any sense. Maybe I'd just forgotten how I'd positioned it last night? I tried to shake off the unease and decided I'd throw the thing out after work. But when I got home that evening, the bike wasn't alone anymore. Sitting next to the bike was a small, weathered doll. Its face was cracked porcelain, with one eye missing and the other barely hanging on by a thread. The fabric of its dress was stained and torn, like it had been dragged through mud. The unsettling part was how it was positioned, propped upright against the bike, as if someone had deliberately set it there. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Was this some kind of prank? Maybe some teenagers messing around? But why here? My house wasn't exactly a beacon of attention, tucked away on a quiet cul-de-sac. A chill crept down my spine as I approached the doll. Its remaining eye seemed to stare right through me, and for a moment, I could have sworn the corners of its mouth were curling up into a faint, mocking smile. I told myself I was imagining things and threw it into the trash bin with the bike. That night, the dreams started. I don't usually remember my dreams, but this one stuck with me. I was standing in my backyard, under the pale glow of a full moon. The bike was there, along with the doll, but they weren't the only things. Scattered around the yard were other objects: a rusted tricycle, a broken toy drum, a pair of small, muddy shoes. They were arranged in a perfect circle, like some kind of ritual. In the center was a figure, obscured by shadows. It wasn't a child, but it wasn't quite an adult either. Just a lanky, hunched silhouette that seemed to pulse with a strange, unsettling energy. It didn't move, but I felt its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. When I woke up, drenched in sweat, I could still feel that heaviness, lingering in the room like a bad smell. The next morning, I rushed outside to check the yard, half expecting to find the objects from my dream there. I know it sounds ridiculous, but after what I'd seen, I wasn't so sure anymore. My heart skipped when I saw that the bike and doll were back, right where I had left them. But now, there was something new. A dirty, frayed ribbon was tied around the bike's handlebars, fluttering slightly in the wind. I could tell it hadn't been there the day before, but I didn't remember seeing anyone around. The strange thing was, I wasn't sure if I wanted to touch it. It felt wrong. The thought crossed my mind that maybe I should move, get away from this weirdness before things got worse, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this was, it wasn't going to leave me alone, no matter where I went. That evening, I sat on my porch, trying to ignore the nagging sensation creeping up my spine. I kept glancing at the yard, half expecting to see more objects appear. It wasn't until after dark, around 11 p.m., that the real horror began. I heard it again, the faint sound of metal scraping across the ground. But this time, it wasn't just a single scrape. It was continuous, rhythmic, almost like someone was dragging something heavy across the yard. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed a flashlight and crept out into the yard, my hands trembling. When I reached the back gate, I turned the light on, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing something that stopped me in my tracks. In the center of my yard, there was a freshly dug-up patch of earth, about the size of a small grave. It was sloppy, uneven, like it had been done in a hurry. I kneeled down, my stomach churning as I shone the light on the dirt. And then, I saw it. Something hard and metallic, half buried in the earth. With shaking hands, I grabbed a small shovel I kept near the garden shed and began to dig. The scraping sound was still echoing in my ears, but I couldn't look away, as if something was forcing me to uncover whatever was buried there. As I dug deeper, the object started to reveal itself. It was another toy, a small metal car, completely rusted and broken, like it had been there for decades. I pulled it out and stood up, my mind racing, trying to process the nightmare unfolding in front of me. That's when I heard it. A soft giggle. It came from behind me, just out of reach of the flashlight's glow. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. There was no way someone could have snuck up on me without making a sound. I whipped around, the light sweeping across the yard, but there was no one there. The yard was still, too still. The giggle came again, this time louder, and I realized with a horrifying certainty that it wasn't a human voice. It was something else, something childlike, but wrong. My blood ran cold as the sound circled me, and I knew I was no longer alone. I don't know how, but I could feel it, a presence just beyond my sight, watching me, waiting. I sprinted back to the house, locking the door behind me as my heart pounded in my chest. The giggles didn't stop. They followed me, echoing through the yard and bouncing off the walls of my home. It felt like they were growing closer, getting louder with each passing second, as if whatever it was closing in on me. I bolted all the windows and blinds, trying to block out the world outside, but the sound was relentless. I tried to call the police, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything coherent. How do you explain something like this? A doll, a bike, strange toys appearing out of nowhere, things that felt like they didn't belong in this world? I hung up, feeling more lost and terrified than I had ever felt before. The air in the house was thick, and the silence that followed was deafening, as if everything had gone still for a brief, dreadful moment. The next morning, when the sun finally rose, it all stopped. The giggles were gone. The toys had vanished, as if they'd never been there. The bike was no longer in the yard, nor the doll, nor the strange metal car I had found. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined it all. Too many sleepless nights, too much stress. But there was no denying the unease that still clung to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't seen the last of whatever had been haunting me. I left the house that morning, taking the long way to work, and I didn't look back. To this day, I still don't know what was happening, and I try not to think about it too often. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I hear faint giggles drifting on the breeze. And that's enough to remind me that some things aren't meant to be explained. It happened to me about 2 years ago, on a night when I was coming back from work. I'm an ordinary guy, nothing too special. I work in an office, and on that particular night, I was tired, just wanting to get home and relax. It was an ordinary day, but what happened that night I will never forget. I was driving my car, in the middle of an intersection, waiting for the traffic light to change. It wasn't too late, but it was already pretty dark. The street was almost deserted, only an occasional car passing by, and I felt calm, almost drowsy, like someone who just wants to get home as quickly as possible. It was when the light turned red that I noticed something strange. I stopped the car, as I always do, and looked at the car next to me, which was stopped at the same light. I don't know why, but I was drawn to look at it. What caught my attention and made me look a second time was that the car had no one inside. I looked at the driver's seat, and it was empty. No person, nothing, just the faint streetlights reflecting on the windows. At first, I thought it might be a parked car, but no, it was stopped at the light, just like me. A chill ran down my spine. I kept trying to figure out what was going on, but before I could think too much about it, the light turned green and I took off, forcing myself to focus on the road. That feeling of unease wouldn't leave my mind, but I tried to convince myself it was just in my head. Maybe it was an old car, with windows so dark that I couldn't see the driver. I don't know. The fact is, I started driving normally, but always with that thought lingering, as if the car next to me had some kind of strange energy pulling me in. It wasn't until the first turn that I realized the car had started following me. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw that same car, the one with no driver, right behind me, just a few meters away. My heart raced immediately. I made the turn, and it did the same, without hesitation. I thought about changing directions, taking a detour, but there wasn't much I could do. The streets were narrow, and I didn't want to risk an accident. Every street I turned onto, it was still there, following closely, always at the same distance. There were no other cars around, just it and me, and the more I thought about trying to shake it, the more it seemed to follow me precisely, as if it knew exactly what I was going to do. I was panicking. What was happening? I quickly looked to the side, hoping the driver would be there, but the driver's seat was still empty. I tried speeding up a little, thinking that maybe, if I went faster, I could lose this car, but it didn't help. It was so close that I started to feel a tightness in my chest. How could it keep up with my car without changing speed, without ever missing a turn? I was starting to lose it, sweat dripping down my forehead as I sped through more and more empty streets. The car seemed tireless, and the sound of the engine was the only thing I could hear, making everything even scarier. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, there it was, just a few meters behind, like an unyielding shadow. At one point, I thought about stopping and trying to get out of the car, maybe asking someone for help or shouting to draw attention. But there was no one on the streets. It was like everything had suddenly emptied out. I was completely alone, and the feeling of being watched grew with every second. When the last turn came, I glanced in the rearview mirror again. The car was still there, but something was wrong. As I turned the corner, I quickly looked back to see if it was still following, and that's when I saw it disappear. It wasn't a regular move. It wasn't the car making a maneuver. It was like the car just vanished. There was no trace of it anymore. I kept driving, not knowing what to do, unable to process what had just happened. I checked the rearview mirror again, then looked around, and the street was empty. Relief came quickly, but it was soon replaced by a deep sense of confusion. I was shaking. What had that been? I didn't understand. I still don't. But what I do know is that something about that car, or maybe something in me, was wrong. After that, I didn't stop. I sped through the next few streets faster than I ever thought I could, until I finally got home. I was exhausted, still not fully understanding what had just happened, but at the same time, something told me I shouldn't tell anyone. I don't know if it was because I was afraid of looking crazy, or because what happened that night was so strange that I even doubted my own sanity. But what bothered me was the feeling that the experience wasn't over. I went to my room, locked the door, and tried to sleep, but nothing felt right. Every shadow seemed darker. Every sound felt distant, like the space itself was stretching toward me, wanting to swallow me. The feeling of being followed wouldn't go away. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, still feeling heavy from lack of sleep. I forced myself out of bed and went to work, trying to forget about that episode. But what happened right after only made everything feel even more real. When I got to the garage, I got in my car and looked in the rearview mirror, like I always do. At first, it seemed like nothing had changed, until an odd feeling took over me. On the driver's seat, on the left side of the car, there was a mark. It wasn't a dent or anything common, but an impression, like someone had sat there during the night. A very defined mark, as if the weight of a body had pressed the upholstery, but there was no one there. That was enough to completely break me. I didn't know what to think anymore. After seeing that mark on the seat, something inside me snapped. I didn't want answers or logical explanations anymore, because none of that made sense. It wasn't normal, and I knew that any attempt to understand it would only make things worse. I decided that, no matter how strange and hard to believe it was, I needed a way to get rid of that nightmare. That car, or whatever it was, couldn't be part of my life anymore. So, I went to the police station, not really expecting them to take me seriously, but I couldn't stay silent any longer. I told them everything, from the moment at the traffic light to the car disappearing. The officer looked at me with skepticism, but to my surprise, he didn't completely disbelieve me. That same day, I went to the intersection where it all happened. I don't know what I expected to find there, maybe some clue, some explanation that would give me a little peace. But when I got there, everything seemed normal. No tire marks, no sign that anything strange had occurred. There was nothing, just the usual traffic passing by, like any other day. I looked at the same spot where the driverless car had stopped, and I felt a chill, but nothing supernatural happened. Sometimes, I wonder to this day if it was all a nightmare, or if I really lived through it. But what I know is that since that night, I've never seen that car again, nor any sign of it, and the feeling of being followed disappeared as suddenly as it began. I was working as a security inspector in a complex of old industrial buildings. It wasn't exactly a dream job, but it paid the bills and gave me the solitude I thought I needed at that point in my life. My shift always started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m., and I spent most of the night walking through empty hallways and inspecting rooms that hadn't seen life since the 80s. That night, the building was a monster of concrete and rust, isolated in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by tall grass fields and absolute silence. As usual, I parked my old car at the entrance, grabbed my clipboard and flashlight, and went in. The sound of my boots hitting the floor echoed through the hallways like a slow drumbeat. The air inside was heavy, humid, clinging to my skin and giving me an unsettling feeling, like I was trapped inside something alive. I remember there was a strange smell, a mix of mold and something metallic, maybe coming from the old pipes. I started my rounds as usual, checking each space methodically. Boiler room, empty. Storage room, no signs of activity. Hallway C, all clear. The building was massive, and my only company was the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional creaks of wood or metal, as if the place was breathing. I had been walking for about an hour when I reached the east hallway, the longest of them all. The silence there was different, dense, like it was wrong. That's when, without warning, all the lights went out. For a second, I froze in place, trying to figure out what had happened. The building was old, and power outages weren't unusual, but this darkness was different. It was absolute, a void so dense it seemed to swallow any light or sound. My first reaction was to grab the flashlight on my belt. I pressed the button and nothing. The flashlight wouldn't turn on. I tried again, shook the thing, swapped the batteries around in a desperate attempt to make it work, but it was useless. The silence around me started to feel heavier, like the air was getting thicker by the second. My heart was already beating faster, and the only thing I could hear was my breathing, growing louder in that suffocating darkness. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Faint at first, a low sound, almost like an echo. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the sound became clearer. A step. Another. Slow, deliberate, like someone walking down the hallway. My whole body tensed up, and I started searching the darkness for any point of reference, anything at all. But there was nothing, just emptiness. I tried calling out, even though I knew it was pointless. "Who's there?" My voice came out shakier than I expected, and the echo stretched out, almost like the building itself was mocking me. The footsteps continued, closer now. I didn't know what to do. I had two options: stand still and hope it was some stupid prank, or try to move, even without knowing where I was going. I chose the latter. I took a step back, feeling along the wall with one hand while gripping the useless flashlight in the other. My plan was simple: go back the way I came. But with every step I took, it felt like I was sinking deeper into that endless hallway. The footsteps I heard, however, seemed to be coming from everywhere. Sometimes ahead, sometimes behind me, and at moments, I was sure they were right beside me. It was impossible to tell where they were, but they were getting closer. My heart was racing, and sweat was running down my face, but the air was getting harder to breathe. That's when I realized the smell had changed. It wasn't just mold and metal anymore. Now there was something else. Something warm and sour, like burnt flesh or blood. That's when I heard a new sound. Heavy, dragged breathing, like someone or something was very close to me. I stopped walking. I held my breath, trying to listen better, but the breathing didn't stop. It grew louder, like whoever it was getting even closer. I turned around quickly, but it didn't matter. There was nothing to see, just total darkness. My whole body was shaking, and I started moving faster, almost running. The footsteps around me picked up speed too, now echoing like multiple people were surrounding me, yet there was still no sign of anyone. It was like the sound was coming from the walls, the ceiling, everywhere at once. My hands were so sweaty I almost dropped the flashlight. When the smell grew even stronger, enough to make me gag, I knew I couldn't stay there another second. I had to get out of that hallway, but it felt endless, stretching on forever with no end in sight. Then I felt it, a slight pressure on my left shoulder, like someone had lightly rested a hand there. It was gentle, almost subtle, but enough to make me lose it. I let out a scream that echoed back at me, as if the building was returning my fear tenfold. I jumped forward, stumbling and falling onto the cold floor. My flashlight slipped out of my hand, hitting the ground with a dry clunk, and suddenly it turned on. The beam flickered a few times before stabilizing, casting a small circle of light on the floor. I grabbed it quickly, pointing it in every direction, expecting to find something. But there was nothing. At least nothing I could see. I got up with difficulty, my legs still shaking as I held the flashlight tightly, like it was my only shield against whatever I couldn't see. The weak, flickering light illuminated only a few feet ahead of me. Even so, it felt like the darkness around me was growing thicker, closing in on me. Then I noticed something. The footsteps had stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it hurt my ears, like the entire building was holding its breath with me. I tried to steady my own breathing, but the air was so heavy it felt like I was inhaling dust and smoke. As I took another step, something caught my eye. There, far down the hallway, just at the edge of the light, I saw a shadow. It wasn't a person or any shape I could recognize. It was more like a dark stain, an absence of form, moving erratically as if trembling or pulsating. My instinct was to point the flashlight directly at it, but the moment I did, the light flickered again and went out completely. At that exact moment, the footsteps returned. This time, they were running toward me. Not just one pair, but many. A chaotic sound of dozens of feet rushing closer and closer. I didn't think. I just ran. My boots pounded against the floor in a frantic rhythm, and the useless flashlight bounced in my hand. I had no idea where I was going. I just needed to get out of that hallway. The sound of the footsteps surrounded me from all sides, growing louder, more overwhelming. My mind was a mess. Part of me wanted to look back, but something told me that if I did, there'd be no coming back. As I ran, I felt something almost trip me, like an invisible hand had reached for my legs. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the deafening noise of the steps. Suddenly, I saw a light ahead. It was faint, but unmistakable, the building's exit. I used every ounce of strength I had left to reach it. As soon as I crossed the door, everything stopped. The footsteps, the smell, the weight in the air. I turned back, still gasping for breath, but the hallway was empty. The lights were on again, and everything looked normal, like nothing had happened. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. I never found an explanation. I never told anyone at work, but I asked for a transfer soon after. To this day, every time I think about those footsteps, I feel that if I had looked back, I would never have left that hallway. I used to work as a freelance photographer. It was an unpredictable job. One day, it'd be wedding photos, the next portraits, and sometimes odd gigs that made me question why I even agreed to them in the first place. That Thursday, late October, I was hired to photograph an old house that was supposedly haunted for a real estate listing. The client was a woman named Paula, who had found me through a mutual acquaintance. On the phone, she sounded nervous, almost desperate, and insisted that I go alone, exactly at 3 p.m. The request struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. People can be eccentric, especially when it comes to property. The address led me to a quiet, almost deserted street on the outskirts of the city. Most of the houses looked abandoned, their windows dark and yards overgrown with weeds. Paula's house wasn't any different. An aging two-story building with peeling gray paint and a yard choked by wild plants. The place had a heavy energy, but I chalked it up to my imagination playing tricks on me. I parked the car, climbed the steps to the porch, and to my surprise, saw the door slightly ajar. I knocked twice, calling out her name, but there was no answer. My chest tightened, like some part of me was warning me not to go in. Still, I pushed the door open. That's when I saw it. As soon as I stepped inside, the smell hit me like a punch to the stomach. It wasn't exactly rotten, but metallic and bitter, the kind of stench that sticks in your throat. The hallway leading to the living room was drenched in shadows, the late afternoon light filtering through the grimy windows. The first thing I noticed was the mess. Chairs were overturned, a vase lay shattered on the floor, and papers were scattered everywhere, like someone had frantically emptied drawers. It was obvious something bad had happened here. I called out again, "Paula, are you okay?" Silence. My heart started to race, but I kept walking. The living room was chaos. The sofa was torn apart, chunks of foam scattered across the floor, and the coffee table had been split in two, as if someone had smashed it with force. A fallen picture frame caught my eye. It held a photo of a middle-aged woman with light brown hair and a timid smile, standing next to a large dog, maybe a Labrador. It had to be Paula. But what unsettled me the most was a mark on the floor near the picture. It was a long, uneven trail, like something heavy had been dragged from there toward a hallway to the right. Sweat started dripping down my back as I tried to decide what to do. I took a deep breath and, against all logic, followed the hallway. The walls seemed to close in the further I went, as if the space was shrinking around me. The floor creaked under my weight, and with each step, the air grew heavier. The trail I had seen in the living room continued here. Dark, smeared stains I couldn't quite identify. When I reached the end of the hallway, there was a door slightly ajar. From inside, I heard a faint noise, like something shifting. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but something, curiosity or sheer stubbornness, kept me moving forward. I pushed the door open slowly. It was a bedroom, small, with a messy bed in the corner and peeling walls that looked like no one had cared for the place in years. On the floor were shards of glass and a fallen lamp, its bulb flickering weakly. But what froze me in place was the mark on the wall. A massive claw mark, deep, as if something with enormous talons had ripped into the plaster. It didn't make sense. It was too large to belong to any normal animal. Just then, I heard a noise behind me, a faint creak, like a door softly closing. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. My heart was pounding, and the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone was suffocating. I couldn't tell if I was being paranoid or if there truly was someone or something there with me. The dim light in the bedroom seemed to pulse, and every shadow around me felt like it was shifting. I decided to head back to the hallway, but as I took my first step, I heard it, a low, almost inaudible sound. It was like whispering, though I couldn't make out the words. It came from somewhere further ahead. I didn't want to keep going, but there was something about that sound, like it was meant to lure me in. I moved through the hallway, trying to steady my breathing. The trail on the floor grew more chaotic, as if whatever had been dragged had been moved in a rush. The sound led me to another door, this one completely shut. It was a simple wooden door, dark and heavy, but it felt different from the others in the house. Older, heavier. When I touched the handle, an icy chill shot up my arm, and I instinctively pulled back. Whatever was on the other side knew I was there. I could feel it. Slowly, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. It creaked endlessly, revealing a dimly lit basement. The metallic smell was stronger now, nearly unbearable. I took the first few wooden steps down, and the sound that had been a whisper was now heavy breathing, rhythmic, echoing off the walls. My heart threatened to burst out of my chest with every step. The stairs creaked like they might collapse, but what truly terrified me was that breathing. It was louder, closer. When I reached the bottom, the floor was cold, rough cement, and I nearly tripped over a pile of scattered junk. There were broken furniture pieces, torn clothes, and what looked like old, rusted tools. In the center of the room, a single hanging bulb swayed slightly, casting dancing shadows along the walls. And then I saw it. In the darkest corner of the basement, something crouched. It's hard to describe, but it was vaguely human, and yet not. Its body was impossibly thin, its arms far too long for its frame, its head tilted to one side, as though studying me. It didn't have eyes, just hollow, empty sockets that somehow still seemed to be staring right at me. When I took a step back, it moved, letting out a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a laugh. I froze. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but I was paralyzed, my breath caught in my throat. The creature started to rise slowly, every movement unnaturally jerky, as though its bones were out of place. Its arms nearly touched the floor, and that sound, the laugh-sob mix, grew louder, more distorted. My body finally reacted, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the scattered junk on the floor. The hanging bulb swayed harder, casting warped shadows that only made everything worse. When it took its first step toward me, I didn't think twice. I turned and ran. I raced up the stairs like a madman, tripping and using my hands to push myself forward. Behind me, I heard it, heavy, rapid footsteps. The basement door seemed so much farther than I remembered, but when I reached it, I slammed it shut with all my strength. Something on the other side pushed back, but I leaned my entire weight against it to lock it. I bolted through the hallway, not daring to look back, and burst out of the house, nearly falling off the porch. My car was right where I'd left it, and within seconds, I was inside, locking the doors with trembling hands. I sped off as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, I saw the house's door slowly creak open, but I didn't stick around to see what would come out. I didn't stop until I was back in the city, surrounded by lights and people, where I finally felt like I could breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Who or what was that? And the scariest question of all, what had happened to Paula? The next day, still shaken, I decided to call the mutual acquaintance who had connected me with her. He sounded confused when I explained what had happened. "Paula?" he asked, hesitant. "Man, the Paula I knew used to live in that house, but she died 3 years ago. It was a strange case. They said she just disappeared, and then they found, well, parts of her. My blood ran cold. I've never gone back to that street, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can still hear that sound, that laughter tangled with sobs." I've always been the kind of person who likes silence, that deep, absolute quiet you can only find far away from everything. Maybe that's why Lisa and I chose that specific island to camp. It was the most isolated spot we could find. We'd both been dealing with so much stress, and the thought of escaping from it all sounded perfect. So that Friday, with clear skies, we rented an old fishing boat and set off. We paddled for about an hour before seeing the island on the horizon. Just a patch of land with trees and a rocky shoreline, no sign of anyone. Exactly what we wanted. When we got there, we started setting up camp right away. I picked a flat spot near the trees, a little way up from the tide, while Lisa went looking for firewood. As I set up the tent, I noticed something strange. A few meters from where we were, there was a pile of ashes, still giving off a little smoke. Someone had left a fire there, and it didn't look that old. I called Lisa over, and the two of us just stood there, staring at it, not sure what to think. The island was supposed to be completely deserted. Who could have been here recently enough for the fire to still be warm? Then Lisa pointed at the ground. There were footprints, fresh and clear, leading away from the fire and down toward the water. That made me feel uneasy, but we tried not to think too much about it. Probably just someone here fishing, I said, more to convince myself than to reassure Lisa. Even so, we couldn't help but look around, trying to see if there were any other signs someone else might still be on the island. But there was nothing, just the footprints and the fire. So we decided to ignore it and keep going with our plan to relax. We started our own fire, cooked some food, and talked while the sun set. The sound of the waves against the rocks was the only thing breaking the silence. That was the kind of peace we'd come for. But around midnight, that peace was shattered in a way I wasn't expecting. I was just about to doze off when I heard a faint sound, distant but clear, like someone rowing really slowly. I froze, trying to listen closer. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Lisa, and she nodded, her eyes wide. We looked at each other, trying to make sense of it. It could have been our imagination, but the sound kept going, coming from somewhere around the island. It was like someone was rowing in slow circles, or cutting through the water in a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. The feeling that we weren't alone just kept getting stronger, making everything feel heavier. We tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but every time the sound of the oars stopped, something else would make us snap back to attention. At one point, I heard what sounded like a low laugh, almost like a whisper, coming from somewhere in the trees. Lisa pressed against me, and I felt my own heart race. The thought of being stuck on that island, with no quick way out, started to weigh on us. We thought about going down to the water to see if we could spot anything, but honestly, neither of us had the nerve to leave the tent at that point. Things only got worse in ways we didn't expect. The next morning, when we stepped out of the tent, we found a message carved into a tree near our camp. The words were short, but enough to chill anyone. "You shouldn't be here." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and my first reaction was to step back, pulling Lisa with me. We looked around but didn't see anyone. The only thing we had was that message, carved in rough letters, like it had been done in a hurry. We couldn't stop wondering how that was even possible. We were sure there was no one else on the island. After seeing that message, our plan of relaxing on the island was pretty much shot. We spent the rest of the day on edge, wandering around camp, looking for any more signs of who could have done that, but we didn't find anything. Every strange sound or movement in the trees made us wonder if someone was watching us. At some point, I started thinking it might be some sick prank, maybe someone else camping nearby who decided to mess with us. But at the same time, who would pull a prank like that in such a remote place? The questions only made us more anxious. When night fell again, we were even more on edge. We didn't start a fire to avoid drawing attention and just stayed in the tent, trying not to make a sound. And that's when we heard footsteps, slow and dragging, moving around our camp. I held my breath, and Lisa squeezed my hand so tightly I thought she'd crush my fingers. The footsteps would come and go, stopping just outside the tent for a few seconds before moving on. Then we heard the sound of something being carved into wood, that dry, scraping noise of a knife cutting through bark. Every second felt like an eternity, making the tension almost unbearable. When we finally gathered the courage to open the tent and look outside, it was already the early hours of the morning. We shined our flashlight around the area and found another message, carved into a tree even closer to where we were. "Leave now." The way the letters were dug into the wood, with deep, uneven cuts, looked rushed and angry at the same time. At that point, any thought of trying to understand what was happening was replaced by pure fear. We knew this wasn't a warning we could ignore. We decided it was time to get out of there before things got worse. We packed up as fast as we could, our hands shaking. As we made our way back toward the boat, the sound of rowing started up again, echoing around the island. It was like someone was following every step, making sure we were leaving. At one point, I caught a faint glimmer moving across the water, maybe someone's flashlight watching us from the darkness. With each step we took, the rowing sounds got louder, almost like it was pushing us to go faster. The fear had taken over completely, and all we wanted was to get to the boat and leave that island behind. As soon as we reached the boat and started rowing, the sound of the oars in the water stopped, like whoever was there was finally satisfied seeing us leave. We were so desperate we didn't even think to look back. We just rowed as fast as we could, hearts pounding. The island faded into the darkness, but the feeling of being watched stayed with us. Not even the waves could drown out the eerie silence that followed. I think, in that moment, we finally understood that island wasn't meant for us, that maybe it never was. When we got back to the dock, it was like waking up from a nightmare. The first thing we did was return the boat and tell the owner what happened. He listened, his face serious and without any sign of surprise, just gave us a piece of advice. That island has a story best left alone. Those words stuck in my mind, echoing along with the sound of those oars. We never found out who that person was or why they did it, but one thing is certain. I never want to hear the sound of oars at night again. Since then, the idea of being isolated, far from any help, has never felt the same. Taking care of little Lucas was always easy. He was 5 years old, a quiet boy who was easy to manage, never gave me any trouble. That night, everything seemed normal. We watched a cartoon, had dinner, and played a bit before I put him to bed. I had been working for the family for almost a year, so I knew his routine well. Lucas had this habit of laughing by himself, but I thought it was just something kids do, so I never really paid much attention to it. But that night, the way he was laughing and whispering quietly seemed different. The laugh sounded muffled, like he was trying not to draw my attention. I only noticed because I was walking down the hall to get a glass of water, and I heard that faint sound coming from his room. When I went in and asked what he was doing, he just looked at me with those big eyes and said, "I'm playing with my friend." I laughed it off and asked, half joking, who this friend was. He turned toward the empty side of the room and pointed to the corner, saying the friend was right there. I froze for a moment, but I thought it was just another one of those phases kids go through with their imaginary friends. When I asked him to describe the friend, Lucas said it was a tall man, with dark clothes and a face you can't really see. That gave me an immediate chill, but I didn't want to scare him, so I just told him it was bedtime and put him back to bed, trying not to think too much about what he'd said. After I got Lucas to sleep, I went back to the living room and tried to relax, but that description wouldn't leave my mind. Every time I thought about the tall man with dark clothes and a face you can't see, I felt this weird chill, like someone was watching me. I tried to distract myself with my phone, but every time the house made any noise, I jumped. It was like there was something in the air, a heavy, uncomfortable feeling I'd never had before in that house. After a while, I decided I was being silly and tried to convince myself it was just Lucas's wild imagination. After all, how many times have we heard stories about strange imaginary friends? But things got worse after midnight. I was almost dozing off on the couch when I heard a noise in the kitchen. It sounded like the cupboard door slamming shut by itself. My heart skipped a beat, but I took a deep breath and slowly got up to check. I walked to the kitchen, trying to stay calm, and found the cupboard door slightly open. There was no one there, so I shut the cupboard and went back to the living room, thinking it was just a draft. But as I turned around, I heard another door slam shut in the hallway. This time, the sound echoed through the house, and a cold feeling washed over me, like someone had just passed right by me. I was starting to panic. It seemed like every time I tried to calm down, something else happened. The silence in the house had become oppressive, and every noise felt amplified. I slowly walked down the hall, trying to convince myself that it was just my paranoia, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Deep down, I knew there was nothing normal about that night anymore. I reached Lucas's room and hesitated for a second before opening the door. He was lying in bed, eyes closed, but he had this strange little smile on his face, like he was amused by something. The worst part was that he was murmuring something, mumbling confused words, almost like he was talking to someone I couldn't see. I stepped closer and quietly asked, "Who are you talking to?" That's when he suddenly opened his eyes and said, in a casual tone, "with him." He said, "You don't have to be scared." Those words froze me in place. I couldn't even respond. I just stood there, motionless, while Lucas closed his eyes again like it was the most natural thing in the world. I left the room shaking, certain I wasn't alone in that house anymore. I sat in the living room, trying to calm down, but it felt like there was an invisible presence, always behind me, following me. I sat on the couch, trying to breathe deeply, but my mind was racing. I was thinking a million things at once. Should I call Lucas's parents? Should I leave the house? Or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I tried to stay still, pretending everything was fine, but the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't let me be. Then I heard footsteps upstairs, and that's when my heart almost stopped. I knew no one else was in the house, but the sound of footsteps was clear, steady, like someone was walking back and forth right above me. I couldn't take it anymore and went to the stairs, looking up, hoping to see something, anything, that could explain the noise. But to my horror, there was nothing there. The footsteps kept going, back and forth, and I could only stand there, frozen, not knowing what to do. It was then that a door upstairs slammed shut hard, and the sound echoed through the house. I wanted to run. I wanted to get out of there, but I was so terrified that my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to gather the courage to go upstairs, but just thinking about what I might find up there made the fear unbearable. After a few seconds, paralyzed on the stairs, I managed to move and, on instinct, decided to check Lucas's room again. I opened the door slowly and saw him sleeping peacefully, but this time, the room felt off. It was heavy, almost suffocating. As I stood there watching him, I felt a shiver and a pressure on my chest, like there was something in the room with me. I was so scared that I stepped back, and that's when I heard, very softly, a laugh that wasn't from Lucas. The sound came from the corner of the room, the same corner he had pointed to before, and this time I knew it wasn't my imagination. The laugh was low, almost a whisper, but it was too close, like someone was hiding right there, staring at me. Without thinking twice, I ran out of the room and slammed the door behind me, gasping for breath. My instinct screamed at me to leave that house as fast as possible, but at the same time, I couldn't just leave Lucas there. I grabbed my phone, and while dialing his parents' number, something started scratching at the door of the room. It was a low, persistent sound, like nails scraping against the wood. My whole body was shaking as I waited for someone to pick up. Then, just before the first ring could finish, the sound stopped suddenly, and the silence felt even more terrifying than any noise. I didn't know what to do anymore. The phone call was almost connected, but then a loud thud from the hallway made me jump. It sounded like something had hit the wall hard, followed by slow dragging, like someone was walking with an enormous weight. I looked at my phone, now trembling in my hands, and saw that Lucas's parents were trying to call me too, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I just wanted to get out of that house. My mind was falling apart, and every second felt like the pressure on my chest was growing. I couldn't stay there anymore. The fear was so overwhelming that I knew I wouldn't make it through another minute. Before I did anything, I took one last look at Lucas's room. Through the crack in the door, I saw the little boy sitting on the bed, staring directly at me. His eyes were locked on mine, but what was even worse wasn't his eyes. The worst part was that, as he stared at me, he smiled. It wasn't a child's smile. It was something different, something that shouldn't have been there. A cold, empty smile, like he knew something I didn't. I ran out of there and never went back to that house. Never went back to take care of that boy. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, but one thing is for sure, Lucas's friend wasn't imaginary. I never used to believe in horror stories. I always thought most of those tales about cabins in the middle of nowhere were just excuses to scare people who were too impressionable. But after what happened on that trip, I can't laugh at those things anymore. My friends and I have always been into adventure, and that cabin up in the mountains seemed perfect. It was winter, the snow already covered most of the road when we got there, and the sense of isolation just made us think we'd have a week of total peace. The cabin was old, but cozy enough. On the first day, we explored the area and took a bunch of photos with the mountains in the background. Everything was going great. None of us had any idea that this trip was about to turn into a nightmare. On the second night, while we were playing cards in the living room, I heard a noise outside, like something dragging across the snow. I went to the window and looked out, but all I saw was darkness and snow blanketing everything. I figured it was just some animal and went back to the game. But it didn't take long for me to notice my friends acting uneasy, exchanging weird looks. One of them, Joao, finally stood up and said he felt a presence outside, like something was watching us. We laughed, thinking he was just trying to scare us, but then he suggested we go outside and check it out. Not wanting to seem scared, we grabbed a flashlight and went out together, keeping a joking tone to hide the discomfort. As soon as we got outside, the first thing that caught our attention were footprints in the snow around the cabin. It was strange because it didn't look like someone had walked up to the cabin. The footprints just started out of nowhere, circled the house, and then vanished as if whoever made them had simply disappeared. That gave me a chill, but I tried to play it off. Joao started following the footprints, but they faded just a few meters from the door. It didn't make any sense. We looked around, trying to figure out where those tracks could have come from, but all we saw was a silent emptiness, the snow covering everything like a giant white sheet. After a few minutes, someone suggested we head back inside, and everyone agreed without hesitation. The night felt heavier, and the cold outside was starting to sting our faces, making staying out there less and less appealing. We locked the door and tried to get back into the mood we had before, but there was a tension hanging in the air. No one wanted to admit it, but something was bothering all of us. When I glanced out the window again, I thought I saw a shadow moving near the trees. At first, I figured it was just a branch swaying, but then the shadow stopped, standing still, like it was watching us. I froze, trying to focus, but before I could be sure of what I was seeing, the thing just wasn't there anymore. We went back to the game, trying to distract ourselves, but the atmosphere kept getting more and more tense. The feeling that something was wrong was impossible to ignore. It felt like the temperature had dropped even more, and the wind outside was so strong we started hearing creaks on the roof and around the windows. At some point, when we were almost convinced it'd be best to just try to sleep it off, the lights flickered, and someone commented that it seemed like the snow was piling up against the windows. I walked over to one of them and, to my shock, the snow was practically blocking the view. The night was getting darker, but strangely, we could still see something outside. A figure standing there, motionless, looking right at the house. The first reaction was shock, but no one wanted to admit the fear. We stayed there, staring at that figure for a few seconds, trying to figure out if it was really a person or some kind of shadow formed by the wind and snow. When the light flickered again, the figure was gone. We looked at each other, trying to pretend we weren't scared, but the silence was absolute. And then, when we turned to look out another window, there it was again, on the other side of the house. The figure didn't seem to feel the cold or be bothered by the wind. It just stood there, still, shifting positions whenever we looked away. By that point, even Joao, who was usually the most skeptical, looked shaken. Every time we looked, the figure was in a different spot around the cabin, but always close enough to be visible, like it knew exactly how far it could go without being fully revealed. There was something deeply wrong about its presence. It looked human, but at the same time, there was something about the way it moved or stood that just didn't feel natural. Its shape blended with the dark, and we could only see it clearly when the flashlight hit it by chance. We were all tense, and someone suggested we close all the curtains and just try to ignore it until morning. That's what we did, but the atmosphere inside was suffocating. Everyone stayed quiet, pretending nothing was happening, but you could see the fear on each face. But even with the curtains closed, we couldn't ignore the sounds coming from outside. They were slow, heavy footsteps, like someone was calmly pacing around the cabin, almost taking their time. At some points, we heard a muffled breathing, something like a dragging sigh that seemed to brush against the walls. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, but the looks on the others' faces told me they heard it too. We sat there, frozen, afraid to move or make any noise, like that might draw more attention from whatever was outside. Each second felt like an eternity, and the sound of the steps only grew louder, closer. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, and everything went eerily silent. I thought maybe it had left, but the relief didn't last. We heard a different sound, something scratching along the wall. It was like nails slowly dragging outside the cabin, moving along each wall as if trying to surround us. We stayed absolutely silent, barely breathing, afraid any noise might draw it in. Someone pulled out their phone, but there was no signal. We were completely isolated. That feeling of helplessness started to sink in, filling me with a rising sense of panic. I kept wondering what that thing wanted, why it was even there, but nothing made any sense. Then something really strange happened. The figure reappeared, this time in the kitchen window. Even with the curtain closed, we could see its shadow on the fabric, standing perfectly still, right up against the glass. My heart was pounding, and someone whispered for us not to move, as if that could make it go away. But then the shadow started to shift. Its shape seemed to change, stretching and twisting into something more bizarre. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with anything human. There was something about that presence that just didn't belong in this place or this world. All of a sudden, the shadow disappeared, and the cabin was dead silent. We waited for a few minutes, too scared to check the windows, until someone suggested we just try to calm down and stay up until morning. Despite the cold, no one wanted to sleep or separate. We stayed there, each of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was almost dawn when we finally decided to take one last look outside, feeling a bit braver, thinking the worst was over. When we opened the door, we saw the snow around the cabin was completely undisturbed. No signs of footprints or any tracks at all. It was like nothing had been out there the whole night. That disturbed us even more. The footprints from the night before, the figure we kept seeing at the windows, the sounds. It all felt like some kind of collective hallucination, but it was impossible that we'd all imagine the exact same thing. To this day, none of us can explain what happened that night, and just thinking about it gives me chills. I don't know if it was some kind of illusion caused by the cold and isolation, or if we really encountered something we couldn't understand. But one thing I know for sure, that feeling of being watched by something that didn't belong to this world has never left me. I never really liked isolated places, but that weekend at the farm seemed like the perfect chance to escape the city and unwind with my friends. The property was huge, with open fields stretching as far as we could see. It was an old farmhouse but well kept. On the first day, everything was normal. We had a barbecue, laughed a lot, walked around the area, and even joked about the strange silence that filled the place. But on the second day, as we explored farther out, we started noticing some weird stuff near the edge of the property. In a few spots under the trees, there were these crude, handmade dolls made of wood, hanging by strings. They were rough and weird-looking, with twisted limbs and oversized heads, like they'd been thrown together in a hurry. But they were placed in a way that made it seem like someone really wanted us to notice them. At first, we laughed it off, saying it was probably some attempt to scare off hunters or something. But the farther we walked, the more of these dolls we found, scattered all around the area. It wasn't just one or two of these works of art. There were dozens, some hung in trees, others half buried in the ground, and others arranged in circles like part of some ritual. At one point, we laughed nervously, like we were trying to shake off the unease, but no one would admit to being genuinely uncomfortable. Still, the feeling that something was off started gnawing at me. It felt like we crossed into a territory that wasn't ours. We decided to head back to the house after seeing so many strange dolls, but on the way, we noticed something even creepier. Near a section of fence marking the property line, we found symbols scratched into the dirt and on the surrounding trees. It was a mix of drawings and letters that none of us could make sense of. They looked like ancient symbols, almost like those you see in witchcraft movies, you know? One of my friends even took a picture, saying he'd research it later, but at that moment, we all kind of avoided talking about what it meant. We just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. Like the open field around us had somehow turned claustrophobic. There was this pressure in the air, something heavy that we couldn't explain. When we finally got back to the house, we tried to forget what we'd seen. We played cards, drank, and tried to get the relaxed vibe back. But later, while we were outside enjoying the bonfire, one of us noticed a faint light off in the distance, near the back of the property, almost in the direction where we'd found the symbols and dolls. It looked like it was coming from a cabin or something none of us had noticed before. Curiosity, of course, won over fear, and we decided to check it out. I didn't want to go, but nobody wanted to stay behind alone at the house, so we all went together. As we got closer to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the smell. A strong odor of damp earth mixed with something rotten, which made everyone stop for a second and reconsider going any further. The faint light came from a tiny window, and we could see shadows moving inside, like something was shifting around. We tried peeking through the cracks in the wall, but we couldn't make anything out clearly. So, one of my friends gathered up the courage and pushed the door open, slowly. When the door creaked open, we found ourselves staring at the strangest interior I've ever seen. There were a bunch of makeshift altars, with melted candles, old photos, and, worse yet, more of those wooden dolls scattered across the floor and hanging on every wall. In the middle of the floor, drawn in what looked like dried dark paint, was a massive circle with more of those symbols, just like the ones we'd seen near the fence. But what really gave me chills were some writings on the walls, done in a red paint that looked too much like blood. They weren't just on the walls. They went up to the ceiling and down the floor, forming these strange, curse-like phrases in the little we could make out. It was like everything in there was directed at intruders or trespassers. The pieces were coming together in my mind. Those altars and dolls weren't for scaring off hunters or anything like that. They were some kind of warning, and now I felt like we crossed a line we never should have crossed. The air inside was thick with tension, a silence that felt like it was watching us. No one moved or said anything, but you could see it on everyone's faces. Something was really, really wrong. That's when one of my friends, the one who'd walked in first, found an old, leather-bound book on one of the altars. The cover was worn, with more of those strange symbols. He opened it and started flipping through, and the pages were full of grotesque drawings and unreadable text. But there was one thing we all understood right away. A bunch of photos tucked between the pages of people staring straight at the camera with these empty, haunting expressions, like they already knew they were going to die. That's when we felt a chill run down our spines. It was like those photos were sending us a message, something like, "You're next." And then, we heard something outside. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, like someone was circling the cabin. The crunch of branches breaking underfoot came closer and closer. No one dared open the door to look, and the fear was so strong you could feel everyone barely breathing. The sounds eventually stopped, but when we looked out the window, there was no one there. We decided to get out of there as quickly as possible, but as soon as we stepped outside, we noticed something even more disturbing. The wooden dolls we'd seen scattered around the field were now all lined up in a path, leading back to the main house. It felt like something or someone was leading us back, in a way that was both menacing and deliberate. We walked back in total silence, not looking to the sides, just following the path of dolls, which seemed to be watching us even without eyes. The feeling of being watched was so intense it was unbearable. When we finally reached the house, we locked all the doors and windows and tried to convince ourselves it was just someone playing a sick joke. But deep down, we all knew it wasn't a joke. The air inside was heavy, like something invisible had come in with us. One of my friends suggested burning the dolls, but at that point, no one wanted to go outside again or touch anything that might be connected to whatever was out there. We stayed there, terrified and just trying to make it through the night, but it felt like the night would never end. We started hearing strange sounds outside, soft footsteps, like someone was circling the house, moving from window to window. At one point, I heard whispering, something I couldn't quite make out, but it sounded almost like a chant. Every second in that house was suffocating, and for a moment, I felt like we were trapped, like there was no way out. Then, out of nowhere, the noises stopped, and the farm fell into a complete, eerie silence. When the silence hit, it was like the air itself had shifted. We sat there, frozen, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Slowly, the fear turned into a strange sense of relief, like some kind of presence had moved away. No one dared to talk about what we'd just been through. It was like we were all trying to bury it as deep as possible, hoping to forget. The next morning, we packed up and left early, not even looking back. None of us wanted to mention the dolls, the altars, or the voices we'd heard in the night. Back in the city, we tried to get on with our lives, but every now and then, I remember that cabin and those photos. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed one more night. I never could find an explanation for those symbols, or the feeling of being watched, or the voices outside. All I know is that we left that place different, with a lingering sense of unease that still follows us. No matter how much I try to forget, that night at the farm feels more haunting than anything else I've ever been through. It was a cold afternoon, and we, a group of friends, decided to explore the abandoned railway tunnel we'd always heard about. None of us had been there before, but the idea of spending a few hours in the dark, quiet tunnel, just to say we did something different, seemed like quite the adventure. The entrance was narrow, which made it even more exciting. The smell of mold hit us as soon as we stepped inside, and the light from our flashlights flickered against the stone walls. For some reason, we couldn't stop nervously laughing, but the mood quickly shifted as we went further in. The walls were covered in moss, and water was running along the floor. With every step, the echo of our movement seemed louder, stranger. Things started to feel off when we saw a light way down the tunnel. It looked like a flashlight, but it was too far away, farther than any of our lights. At first, we thought it could be another group, but the way the light moved, it was strange. It didn't seem to be moving like a person walking. It started coming closer, but very slowly, way too slowly, almost like it was following us. I glanced at the others, but no one said anything because, honestly, we were all thinking the same thing. This was getting weird. The light kept getting closer, and our breathing started to get heavier. When the flashlight suddenly went out, silence took over. That's when we heard it, a whisper. The whispers were soft but clear. At first, I thought it was just in our heads until the names started being spoken. One by one, my name, followed by each of our friends' names, echoed through the tunnel, like someone knew exactly who we were. I froze. It wasn't just a whisper. It was like something was watching us, calling us. I stiffened, looking at the others, and I could see they were just as scared. The nervous laughter that had started to rise turned into palpable tension, like the air itself was getting thicker. I didn't know what to do. None of us did. The only thing we wanted was to get out of there. So, we started running. We weren't thinking about what was in our way anymore. We just needed to get out as fast as we could. The tunnel felt longer than before, the exit now seeming impossible to reach. Every step we took, every heavy breath we took, only made the feeling that something was right behind us feel more real. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw the light from the entrance, a relief I can't even describe. But before we could reach the mouth of the tunnel, one of our friends, the last one in line, screamed. He turned to us, his face pure terror. He seemed to feel something on his back. When he finally ran out of the tunnel, we looked at him, and we all saw the marks. There were 2 hand-shaped marks on his shoulders, like someone had grabbed him tightly, like an invisible hand had held him back. I don't know how, but we all knew that wasn't normal. We were in shock, not being able to look at the marks on our friend's shoulders. He looked paler than ever, and when he asked what had happened, no one could answer. There was no explanation. His hands were shaking as he tried to step away, and he kept talking about how he felt something, like he was being pulled back into the tunnel, like someone was trying to stop him from leaving. But no one else felt anything. There was no more light inside, no more sound. And still, when we looked back toward that part of the tunnel, it felt like something was still watching us. The air was heavier than before. We left quickly, not looking back, but the fear stayed with us. To this day, I can't explain what happened. We never went near that tunnel again, and we never talked about it after that day. The strangest part is, as we walked away, I realized the feeling of being watched never went away. It was like that tunnel was still there, watching us, waiting. I don't know what happened to that tunnel, or to the lantern, or the marks. All I know is that, since that day, nothing has ever felt the same. And the worst part? It feels like no matter how much time passes, the fear of going back there still lingers inside me. Like it's trapped, waiting for it to happen again.